The sky over occupied Europe was not quiet in 1943. It trembled. It burned. It echoed with the roar of engines and the rattle of machine guns. In those clouds, death traveled fast, but so did courage. It was a battlefield without trenches, without front lines, where every second meant life or death. Young men from Canada and the United States climbed into cockpits each morning, knowing that by evening many of them would never return. They were farmers, mechanics, students, factory workers, ordinary boys transformed into aviators. They strapped themselves into war machines that could climb to 30,000 feet and spit fire at 400 miles per hour. Some flew bombers heavy with death, others piloted sleek fighters designed to hunt. The Luftwaffe was still a formidable enemy then, dominating much of the European sky. But the Allies had something else: growing strength, growing skill, and an unbreakable will. Before dawn, airfields across southern England shook with the sound of engines warming up. Rows of aircraft stood like steel beasts: B-17 Flying Fortress bombers, P-51 Mustang fighters, Canadian-built Avro Lancasters and nimble Spitfires flown by young men who could barely grow a full beard. Ground crews tightened bolts, checked ammunition belts, and patted the wings like trusted friends. Somewhere in the mist, a radio crackled. Orders were brief, clipped, professional. Target, deep in Germany. Expect heavy resistance. Wheels up in 20. Men exchanged quiet glances. Someone laughed, a dry, nervous laugh. Another adjusted a lucky charm tied around his neck. They knew the odds. On some missions, entire crews disappeared without a trace. But none of that mattered now. They were part of something bigger, an air war that would break the backbone of Nazi Germany. Engines roared to life. Bombers began to roll down the runways. Fighter escorts followed, slicing through the early morning fog. From the ground, the sight was unforgettable, hundreds of aircraft rising into the gray sky in perfect formation. To a German soldier looking up that morning, it must have felt like the sky itself was turning against them. But for the men in those cockpits, the war was only beginning. At 15,000 feet the world looked almost peaceful. White clouds stretched like cotton, and the English coastline faded into the distance. But beneath that calm surface lay danger in every direction. Somewhere ahead, waiting like a coiled snake, was the Luftwaffe. German radar had already picked up the incoming formations, and fighters were being scrambled from bases in France, Belgium, and deep inside Germany. Inside the cockpit of AB-17, the crew was already sweating despite the freezing altitude. The pilot, a 22-year-old from Kansas, tightened his oxygen mask. Beside him, the co-pilot kept his eyes on the horizon. In the radio compartment, a Canadian operator tapped out coded signals to the rest of the formation. In the nose turret, a young gunner pressed his gloved hands against the cold glass and muttered, "Here we go." Far behind and above them, the Mustang escorts moved like hawks. They weren't just flying for glory. Their mission was simple: keep the bombers alive. The Luftwaffe's fighters would tear through the formation if they broke free. These escort pilots knew that every second counted. "Bandits, 3 o'clock high!" The radio burst to life. 12 black specks emerged from the sun, Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s. The German pilots were veterans, aggressive and disciplined. Their attacks came fast, from above, diving straight toward the bomber stream. Within seconds, the blue morning sky was shredded by tracer fire. Explosions dotted the horizon like deadly blossoms. One bomber caught a burst and rolled onto its back, trailing smoke. Its crew never had a chance. The Mustang pilots dove into the fight without hesitation. Their engines screamed as they met the enemy head-on. Wingmen stuck close to each other, 2 against 2, 4 against 4. A Canadian pilot named Jack Fraser pulled the trigger and watched his .50 caliber guns light up the sky. A Messerschmitt tried to climb away, but Jack stayed on him, steady as a hunter. Flames burst from the German fighter, and it spiraled into the clouds. Jack didn't celebrate. There was no time. Another enemy was already on his tail. Below, the bomber crews kept flying straight, disciplined, focused on the mission. Bomb doors opened like metal jaws. This was the grim arithmetic of the air war. Some would hit their targets, some would never come home. And yet they flew. The air war over Europe wasn't won in a single day. It was forged in blood, raid after raid, battle after battle. Canada and the United States threw everything they had into the skies. Thousands of new pilots trained every month. Factories ran day and night, producing aircraft faster than the Germans could shoot them down. For every bomber lost, another was waiting on the runway. For every pilot who fell, another young man stepped up to take his place. It wasn't cold strategy. It was willpower made of flesh and steel. One of the most important campaigns came in early 1944. The Allies needed to break the Luftwaffe before launching Operation Overlord. If the Germans controlled the skies over Normandy, the invasion fleet would be slaughtered before it reached the shore. So the Americans and Canadians launched relentless bombing raids deep into the heart of Germany. They targeted airfields, factories, and fuel depots. Their goal was clear: starve the Luftwaffe of everything it needed to fight. The missions were brutal. On some days, more than 60 bombers never returned. Fighter pilots flew 3, sometimes 4 sorties a day. The skies were a constant battlefield. Burned metal, smoke, and the smell of oil hung in the air. Villages and cities on both sides of the front learned to live under the sound of engines. In a cramped bomber over Hanover, a Canadian tail gunner named Robert Caldwell spotted 2 German fighters coming in fast from 6 o'clock low. He didn't hesitate. He swung his twin Brownings and opened fire, the vibrations shaking the turret. Tracers found their mark. One German fighter burst into flames, the second broke off. His crew cheered for a moment, but then flak exploded near the left wing, tearing holes through the fuselage. Blood and oil mixed on the floor. No one screamed. They simply went back to their positions. The mission wasn't over. Above them, the Mustangs and Spitfires pushed deeper, driving the Luftwaffe back. Every mile gained in the air meant more security for the soldiers who would soon fight on the ground. By spring 1944, something extraordinary happened. The once feared Luftwaffe began to falter. It wasn't sudden, it was like watching a great storm lose its strength. Experienced German pilots were being lost faster than they could be replaced. Fuel shortages crippled training programs. The Allies had grown stronger, more coordinated, more ruthless. Daylight raids that once cost hundreds of lives began to pierce deep into German territory with increasing success. On one mission over Berlin, American and Canadian pilots faced a wall of flak that turned the sky black. Explosions ripped through the formations, shaking the aircraft like toys. A Lancaster bomber carrying a Canadian crew took a direct hit to its starboard engine. Flames licked across the wing. The pilot, 23-year-old Charles McKinley from Ontario, refused to break formation. "Keep her steady!" he shouted over the intercom. With smoke trailing behind him, he held the line all the way to the target. Bombs dropped. The mission was a success. McKinley's plane barely limped back to England, its crew shaken but alive. Acts like this became legend among the squadrons. Meanwhile, the fighter pilots ruled the upper sky. The P-51 Mustang changed the game. With its long range and speed, it could escort bombers deep into Germany and still fight toe-to-toe with the Luftwaffe. Pilots like Jack Fraser began to push the enemy back, not just defending but dominating. When German fighters rose to meet them, they found Allied pilots already waiting. Radio chatter filled the air. "Bandits 11 o'clock, engage!" Dozens of aircraft dove and twisted. The dogfights were fierce, sometimes so close that pilots could see the faces of their enemies. There was no glamour here, just skill, instinct, and survival. When Jack shot down his 4th enemy of the day, he didn't shout in triumph. He just whispered, "That's one more who won't hit our boys on the beach." As D-Day approached, the sky was slowly being claimed by the Allies. And every pilot, every mechanic, every gunner knew it. The early morning of June 6, 1944, began not on the beaches, but in the clouds. As landing craft assembled in the channel, swarms of Allied planes roared overhead. Fighters, bombers, transport aircraft, thousands of them. The Luftwaffe barely stirred. Its once terrifying presence over Western Europe was a shadow of its former self. Months of relentless air combat and bombing campaigns had left German air power crippled. Canadian Spitfires screamed low over the beaches, strafing German positions to clear the way for the first wave of soldiers. American Mustangs ranged further inland, hunting down any Luftwaffe fighters daring to take off. Overhead, massive bomber formations targeted railways, bridges, and fortifications. The air belonged to the Allies. In one cockpit, Canadian pilot William "Bill" Campbell peered through a cracked canopy, sweat mixing with engine oil. His Spitfire had already taken a hit from light flak, but he stayed in formation. Below, he could see the invasion fleet, thousands of ships covering the horizon like a floating city. He muttered to himself, "No one stops this today." A sudden radio call. 109's at 2 o'clock high. Campbell's head snapped up. A small group of German fighters had managed to break through. The Allied fighters banked hard. The sky exploded into a swirl of contrails and tracer fire. The Germans fought desperately, but they were outnumbered, outmatched, and outflown. One by one they fell. Meanwhile, bombers hammered the coastal defenses. A Canadian Lancaster dropped its payload on a key rail junction near Caen, cutting off German reinforcements. American Thunderbolts and Mustangs strafed roads and bridges, turning columns of trucks into burning wrecks. On that morning, air superiority was not just a tactic, it was the shield that allowed the ground invasion to succeed. When the first Allied soldiers stepped onto the beaches, they did so under a sky their own pilots had won for them. The invasion was just the beginning. In the weeks after D-Day, the air war intensified. As ground troops pushed inland through the bocage of Normandy, Canadian and American pilots worked around the clock to keep the skies clear. They weren't fighting only other pilots now. They were hunting trains, trucks, and tanks. Their job was to choke the German war machine from above. Every day, Thunderbolts and Mustangs took off loaded with bombs and rockets, flying low over the countryside. They attacked bridges, convoys, and supply depots, turning roads into smoking graveyards. German troops began calling the Allied fighter bombers Jabos, fast, merciless hunters that could appear out of nowhere. For pilots, these missions were more dangerous than high-altitude dogfights. Flak guns and machine nests lined the roads. A single well-aimed burst could rip through the thin aluminum skin of a fighter and send it spiraling into the fields below. But the pilots pressed on. They learned to fly low and fast, skimming treetops, striking like lightning and disappearing before the Germans could react. In a village near Falaise, a young Canadian pilot named David Morrison flew his Mustang over a German column. Trucks, tanks, and half-tracks were jammed on the narrow road. "Here we go," he muttered, diving toward them. He pressed the firing button. .50 caliber bullets and rockets tore through the vehicles, setting off explosions like a row of firecrackers. Black smoke filled the air. Behind him, 2 more fighters came in for the kill. The column was gone in minutes. Below, German soldiers learned to fear the sound of engines overhead. The air no longer belonged to them. It belonged to the men who ruled the sky. The battle for air superiority wasn't just fought with bullets, it was also a war of endurance. Canadian and American air crews worked under brutal schedules. Some flew 3, even 4 sorties a day. Mechanics barely slept, keeping the planes alive under relentless use. Runways were patched with steel mats, tires replaced in the rain, engines changed in the dark. The air war was relentless, and everyone on the ground knew they were holding the line as much as those in the sky. Pilots became shadows of themselves. Their eyes were bloodshot, their hands calloused from the controls. Yet, every morning, they climbed back into their cockpits. Many carried the weight of lost friends. Squadrons changed faces faster than anyone could get used to. One day a man shared a cigarette with you before takeoff. The next, his plane didn't come back. Jack Fraser, now a veteran with more than 60 missions, stared at the empty bunk of his wingman. "We were supposed to get home," he whispered to no one. But there was no time to mourn. An orderly burst into the barracks. "Briefing in 5 minutes! Wheels up at dawn!" Jack pulled on his flight suit again. War didn't wait for anyone. Over Normandy, the skies became a conveyor belt of fire. Fighter bombers swept the roads, bombers hit supply centers, and escorts hunted anything with a black cross on its wings. The Luftwaffe tried to fight back, but fuel shortages and a shrinking pool of experienced pilots made their efforts weaker each day. For every German fighter that rose, 2 or 3 never returned. The Allies didn't just win the air war with better planes. They won it with grit. As the summer of 1944 turned into autumn, the Allies advanced toward Paris and beyond. Canadian and American pilots followed every step of the ground troops, clearing the way from above. Cities like Caen, Falaise, and Rouen burned under relentless airstrikes. Railways were shattered, bridges collapsed, and entire German divisions found themselves stranded with no fuel and no supplies. In late August, during liberation of Paris, Allied aircraft darkened the skies over the city's outskirts. Pilots like Jack Fraser flew overhead, watching columns of German troops trying to flee east. "You can run," he muttered into his mask. "But we own the sky now." His Mustang dove low, guns blazing. Trucks exploded one after another. For the soldiers on the ground, these air raids were devastating. They had nowhere to hide. Paris fell. Not because of air power alone, but because air power crushed the enemy's ability to fight. The Allies could move faster, strike deeper, and control the battlefield from above. For the first time since the war began, the Luftwaffe was no longer the hunter. It was the hunted. Every sortie brought them closer to the Rhine. And every victory in the air meant one less German division to fight on the ground. The closer the Allies moved to Germany, the more desperate the Luftwaffe became. By late 1944, they launched everything they had left. Young, barely trained German pilots climbed into aging aircraft with little fuel and almost no hope. It wasn't enough. In the cold December skies over the Ardennes, during Battle of the Bulge, German forces launched a surprise counterattack. Tanks, infantry, and artillery pushed through the snow, hoping to split the Allied lines. It was a last, furious gamble by Hitler's war machine. If they could take the skies away, even briefly, they might turn the tide. But the skies were no longer theirs to take. When the weather cleared, hundreds of Allied aircraft rose into the winter air. Thunderbolts and Mustangs screamed over the frozen forests. Bombers smashed bridges and crossroads. German armored columns that had been advancing boldly now found themselves trapped in narrow valleys. David Morrison and his squadron dove again and again, turning tanks into blazing wrecks. "They thought they could surprise us," he said through gritted teeth. "But they forgot who rules the sky." For the soldiers on the ground, the air support was a lifeline. American infantry cheered when they saw Allied fighters streak overhead. The Germans, on the other hand, scattered for cover. Their winter gamble was melting away under a rain of bombs and bullets. The air war had become a hammer, and the enemy was the anvil. Winter dragged on, but the Luftwaffe was dying. Its once elite fighter corps was a shell of what it had been in 1940. Shortages of fuel and experienced pilots crippled its operations. Meanwhile, American and Canadian pilots flew with increasing confidence, their missions now reaching deep inside the Reich. Factories that had once churned out tanks and planes were reduced to rubble by precision bombing campaigns. Strategic raids, like those over the Ruhr industrial region, shattered Germany's ability to sustain a modern war. The Allied air forces became not just a shield, but a weapon that could destroy an enemy without ever setting foot on the ground. Jack Fraser, now one of the most experienced pilots in his wing, flew missions over the Rhine. "It's different now," he told a rookie pilot on the tarmac one morning. "They used to hunt us. Now we hunt them."